The opinions shared on this show reflect those of the individual speaker and not of any 12-Step Fellowship as a whole. And though we discuss 12-Step Recovery and the impact it had in our lives, we do not promote or endorse any 12-Step Anonymous program. It's time for the SHAIR Recovery Podcast, where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey in recovery. And now, here's your host, O.
Hi there, my name's Omar, but everybody calls me O. I'm the host and the founder of the SHAIR Podcast. So what is the SHAIR Podcast? First of all, we spell SHAIR S-H-A-I-R, which is an acronym for Sharing Helps Addicts in Recovery. It's a podcast where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey of recovery. And every Tuesday, we will release a brand new episode on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Now, these episodes will last between an hour and an hour and a half. During each episode, recovering addicts and alcoholics will share their stories with us, their battles against drugs and alcohol, the wreckage it caused in their lives, when they hit rock bottom, and finally their journey into recovery up until today. My hope is that these stories will inspire millions to stay clean and sober. The format is very simple, and it will be the same on every interview. The idea behind having a format is so that every time you listen to a SHAIR Podcast interview, you'll know exactly what to expect. First, we start off with a few warm-up questions. The first question helps us to get to know the person I'm about to interview. I ask them to tell us about how their life is today, their hobbies, what they do for a living, and to take us into their normal daily routine, including recovery. For many addicts and alcoholics, the thought of life without drugs and alcohol seems boring, mundane, almost impossible. So right from the beginning, before the interview really gets started, we want our listeners to have an idea of how wonderful life can be without drugs and alcohol. The lives that we lead today are so much better than what we thought was possible. Even before we started using drugs and alcohol, many of us were lost, conflicted, and confused. It was the drugs that helped us connect with society. They helped us break out of our shells, so to speak. But ultimately, they crushed us. When we finally found recovery and saw that there was hope, we quickly realized that we had to give up all the drugs and alcohol in order to truly recover. Giving up the substances that at first gave us confidence, helped us break out of our shell, and adapt to society was like extinguishing our identity. No more clubs, no more bars, no more drugs, no more escape, nothing. We no longer had controlled substances to help us control our feelings and emotions. So initially, even though there is hope, there is also a tremendous amount of fear of what will life be like once I stop using. That is the reason why the first question I ask my guests is, what is your life like today? Because more than anything else, I want to immediately give the listener hope of a life beyond their wildest dreams. Now, once we've given the listener a snapshot of what life is like as soon as they embrace recovery, the next question is how old they were the first time they drank or used drugs, and more importantly, how it made them feel. What that will do is prompt them to go back to that moment in time when they first used drugs and alcohol and reconnect with their beginning. As an alcoholic or an addict, from the moment you take that first drink or drug, the clock starts ticking. It's only a matter of time before the addiction takes over and eventually you hit rock bottom. After we've addressed that moment in time and the feelings associated with it, our guest is pretty warmed up, and it's time for me to turn the show over to them. This is the part of the interview where our guest shares their entire story, what their childhood was like, the transition from social drinking and using to hardcore drug abuse and alcoholism, the wreckage it caused in their lives and the lives of those around them, when they hit rock bottom, and finally their journey into recovery up until today. Now, as soon as they're done sharing their story, we move into what I like to call For the Newcomers. At the end of our show, we ask our guests to answer 5 questions about their experience in early recovery that will impact and inspire the newcomer. The questions are as follows. 1. What was keeping you from getting clean or staying clean when you first got introduced to recovery? 2. At what point did you have a spiritual awakening, that aha moment in recovery when you realized that you were powerless over drugs and alcohol and for the first time had developed a hope that you could recover? 3. What is the best book you read in early recovery and would recommend to a newcomer? 4. What is the best suggestion you have ever received? 5. If you could give a newcomer only one suggestion, what would it be? That's the basic format for the podcast. This is what our listeners can expect every time they listen to an episode of the SHAIR Podcast. It will always have this structure. So now we dive into my story a little bit. Who is O? Well, I've been in recovery for 11 years now, but before recovery, I spent 4 years in denial about being a drug addict. My drug of choice was predominantly alcohol and cocaine, but along with those drugs was pot, ecstasy, mushrooms, or whatever was at the party, really. During those 4 years, I lost my business, my friends and business partners disowned me, and my wife left me. My health was very poor, and I was exhibiting severe symptoms of schizophrenia and paranoia. It wasn't until my daughter was born, and I held her in my arms for the first time, that I truly surrendered and accepted that alone, I could not win the battle against drugs and alcohol. It was in that moment I experienced my first spiritual awakening, and I asked the God of my understanding to relieve me of my drug addiction, if only for the sake of my daughter. That is the moment my journey in recovery began. My higher power restored me to sanity, and today I live a life beyond my wildest dreams. I turned my life over to the care of God, and I began to work a 12-step program of recovery feverishly. Once I recognized that recovery had saved my life, I knew that at some point I would have to pay it forward. I would have to give back what was freely given to me. Very early in recovery, I adopted a phrase I use often whenever someone thanks me for being of service and carrying the message. I reply with, HP, baby, which stands for higher power, baby. Everything I am today is because of recovery and my higher power, which I call God. You will hear me say HP, baby in almost every episode, because the credit always goes to him. So now, how did I get into podcasting? I started listening to podcasts on my commute to work in the early part of 2013. It takes me 45 minutes to an hour to get to the office. So, I'm on the road between 1.5 to 2 hours each day. My assistant kept raving about this great podcast she was listening to and that I would love it. At the time, I didn't even know what a podcast was. The name of the podcast is Entrepreneur on Fire, and she was right. I was hooked instantly and started listening to the show addictively. It is a great podcast, very well structured with amazing stories from entrepreneurs all over the world and their success stories. At some point, the host of the Entrepreneur on Fire show, John Lee Dumas, was promoting his new website called Podcaster's Paradise. In one of the podcast interviews, John mentioned that he was going to be offering a free webinar on how to start your own podcast. It piqued my interest because at this point, I was a big fan of podcasting, and I had already started listening to other podcasts as well. At the time, he had recently launched Podcaster's Paradise, so he was offering a lifetime membership for under $300. I immediately jumped on it. I bought the 1-year membership, and I promptly put it on the shelf for the next year. I didn't know what I was going to use it for, but I knew that someday I would. My initial thought was to do a podcast about entrepreneurs in Costa Rica. I was going to call it Killing It in Costa Rica, a podcast about successful entrepreneurs in Costa Rica. But every time I thought about the content for the podcast, I just could not find the motivation. Along with listening to podcasts daily, I would listen to audiobooks such as Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, and Crush It by Gary Vaynerchuk, just to name a few. I got an Audible account so I could listen to audiobooks on my way to the office along with the podcast. These books were just as inspiring as the podcasts. They say that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Now, after a year and a half of listening to podcasts and listening to audiobooks, I was listening to Gary Vaynerchuk's book, Crush It. And halfway through the book, I knew I was going to launch my first podcast, and it was going to be about recovery. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but I remember hearing something along the lines of, figure out what it is that you're passionate about and build your business around that. Forget about making money, build an audience. Create amazing, relevant content, and you will be successful. Period. I can still hear Gary's voice in the audio saying those words. And simply put, it was the catalyst that ignited the SHAIR Podcast. Thanks, Gary. Seriously, I was so unbelievably inspired that in that moment I realized I didn't need to listen to one more audiobook. I didn't need to listen to one more inspiring interview by an entrepreneur. I had everything I needed to get started, and I realized that the thing I'm the most passionate about in the world is recovery. So now, where did the name SHAIR come from? Now, this is an interesting story. At first, I was going to take the Killing It in Costa Rica concept and call it Killing It in Costa Rica, the Recovery Podcast. At this moment, I was more concerned about the content than I was about the actual name or the logo. But I was working on both simultaneously. However, when I thought about the keywords that I was going to use for iTunes and Stitcher Radio, I realized I needed a name that had the right keywords in it. And Killing It in Costa Rica has nothing to do with recovery. So funny enough, I came up with IRS, the IRS Podcast, Inspiring Recovery Stories, which I was very excited about, and I actually registered those URLs. I quickly went and very happily told my wife about the name, and she looked at me like I was a madman. Absolutely crazy. IRS? Why would you use a term like IRS? It's just horrible. It's a horrible connotation. No one is going to like it. I said, well, maybe you're right. Maybe I should think this over. Later on that week, I had dinner with two of my closest friends, Robert and Roger. And during dinner, I told them about the podcast. Again, it was still on the drawing board. There was no website, no logo, there was nothing. It was all in my head. I said, hey guys, listen, I want to start a recovery podcast. They said, great. What's a podcast? So first I had to explain what a podcast is and then pitch them on the name I came up with. The IRS Podcast, Inspiring Recovery Stories Podcast. Of course, I got the same reaction. It's terrible. Don't do it. IRS, I hate it. Roger suggested, listen, forget about the IRS. You've got to do something that's, catchy. How about something about on the air as an acronym for addicts in recovery? Okay, so how about the Fresh Air Podcast? Fresh Addicts in Recovery Podcast. I was like, wow, it's like a breath of fresh air. It sounds awesome. I love it. I came home that night, but of course, fresh air was already taken. The next morning, my wife and I took the dog for a walk, and during the walk, I told her about the dinner I had and about how the IRS idea tanked. Shocker. I mentioned Roger came up with fresh air. Then she said, well, fresh air, no surprise it's already taken, but I like the air idea. Now, what is it that you guys do in recovery? Well, you share. Sharing helps addicts in recovery. So I was like, sharing helps addicts in recovery. SHAIR, the SHAIR Podcast. It's brilliant. It's done. And so the SHAIR Podcast was born, a collaboration between my wife Marcella and two of my closest friends in recovery, Robert and Roger. I immediately started working on the logo, the color scheme, the website, the page layout, the content, the guest format. It was absolutely effortless from that moment on. The minute I discovered what I was passionate about, and more importantly, what my purpose in life was, everything else became completely automatic. I had already been listening to all the podcasts, all the audiobooks, and I began immersing myself in the Podcaster's Paradise tutorials. The foundation was already there. I just had to start applying it. I literally stopped listening to podcasts and audiobooks. I only listened to music on my way to the office to get inspired. It became like movie soundtracks. I literally just started to envision things. I envisioned the look, the feel, and as soon as I got to the office or at home, I just started to execute. Within 3 months, I had a completed website, logo, equipment, 8 interviews done, ready to go. My purpose for this podcast is to help millions of recovering alcoholics and addicts that struggle with addiction, that have lost their way, that need inspiration, and to reconnect with recovery. My hope is to touch people through relatable experiences of individuals who have gone through the same pain and mistakes they have gone through and come out on the other side thriving thanks to recovery. I have come to realize that an unexpected gift of this entire experience is how cathartic recording a podcast is for my guests and for me as well. Sharing these stories through the podcast connects us to recovery in a way we hadn't experienced before and immortalizes the story of each of our lives. With these stories, we can save lives, our own lives even. And so, this is why the SHAIR Podcast was born. Thank you, God, for all the inspiration. HP, baby.
Thank you for joining us on the SHAIR Recovery Podcast. To check out the show notes page on this interview or to thank our guests for sharing their story, go to www.theshairpodcast.com. While you're on the website, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on the latest news, podcasts, and interviews. Want to be one of our guests and share your story? Then go to our website and click on the Share Your Story button. We share our inspiring recovery stories every Tuesday, so subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio to get your free weekly download. We'll see you then.